All right. Um, it's a real pleasure, a great honor to welcome Adam Higginbotham to join us to talk about his book, newly out in paperback, Challenger: A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space. And for our assembly here today, I do have 20 copies of the book, so I'll send a quick how-to in terms of getting a copy if you haven't gotten one yet. Adam Higginbotham is a British writer born in Somerset in 1968. His first book, Midnight in Chernobyl, was published in 2019, the winner of the 2020 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and the Colby Award for Military Intelligence History. Midnight in Chernobyl was named one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2019 and became an international bestseller translated into 25 languages. His second book, Challenger: A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space, was published in May 2024, again, just out in paperback this year. A New York Times bestseller, Challenger won the 2024 National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, the 2024 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction, and was a finalist for the 2025 Carnegie Medal in Nonfiction. Higginbotham's work has also appeared in newspapers and magazines, including The New Yorker, Wired, Smithsonian, and the New York Times Magazine. He's the former U.S. correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph magazine and editor-in-chief of The Face, and he lives with his family today in New York City. And he's joining us from the road. So thank you, Adam. It's really an honor. I saw this book in the bookstore. It had just come out in paperback. I saw it just a few weeks ago, picked it up, and I just tore through it. It was such a riveting read. I really recommend everybody pick up a copy and read this as soon as you can. I think it's really time. I had actually paused publicity on this until the Artemis landed safely. I'm not very superstitious, but I was happy to see, of course, they came down safely. And then I very quickly told everybody, come on, let's talk about this terrific book. Can you start just a little bit with the genesis of the book and whether there are any connections to your previous project on the Chernobyl incident?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. That was a very generous introduction. Absolutely, there were connections. Because part of the reason that I started thinking about Challenger in the first place was that while I was publicizing the Chernobyl book, I was often asked if I remembered where I was when I heard that the accident had happened. And of course, I mean, I didn't, largely because, the Soviet Union tried to suppress information about it, kept it secret. So information about it kind of trickled out gradually. But what I would always say was I remembered exactly where I was almost, exactly 3 months previously when I heard about what happened with Challenger. So it was kind of, that was already on my mind. And I was also aware of the fact that the accidents in their broad strokes had a lot of commonalities. One thing in particular was that, one of the causes, the long-term causes of both accidents was this concept of the normalization of deviance, which is where you experience anomalies with an engineering project in particular over a long period of time, and it gradually inures you to the idea that minor things might go wrong, and it eventually you develop a false sense of security and you start taking bigger and bigger risks with it. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to write about next, one of the ideas that I started looking into was Challenger. But because I was 17 when it happened, so I'd lived through it, and I kind of thought, like a lot of people, I think, at 30 something years removed, I thought I knew what the story was. And it was only when I started kind of digging into it a little bit and reading some of the stuff that had been published since the first flush of material had come out in 86 and 87, that I realized that what I knew was only a fraction of the story. And so I wanted to, reconstruct events in the same way that I had with the Chernobyl book and bring to light some of the stories that I felt had not really been told before or had been neglected in the decades since the accident happened.
That was that was very clear as I was reading the book, and it's striking how I think it became a sort of touchstone or a placeholder for a lot of ideas, maybe in a sort of hasty way, because when you clearly spent so much time with this topic, a lot of these personalities started coming through. The one that I think came through most clearly was McNair. I think Ronald McNair as just a remarkable individual, but also we learned, and we can come back to that because I think as the father of a kid who's a karate enthusiast and a computer programming enthusiast, and he's just seems to be this absolutely heroic and really remarkable individual. Actually, can you talk a little bit about Ronald McNair, about this one of the astronauts, and what you uncovered there in your research?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, when I found out more about his story, I find it hard to believe that he wasn't the subject of his own biopic, right? Because he's just such a brilliant character. But he's really kind of relatively unknown. I mean, because the retellings of the Challenger accident story that have appeared over the last 30 years, tended to focus on Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, for kind of understandable reasons, because she was the most well publicized member of the crew in the run up to the launch, and then after the accident happened. But there were 7 members of the crew, and the other 6 members of the crew were all equally remarkable in their own ways. But Ron McNair, like you say, I mean, partly because he kind of overcame so many astonishing obstacles to make it to the launch pad that day. I mean, he grew up with 2 brothers in a Jim Crow town in the segregated South. And the circumstances where he and his brother actually used to, when school was out, they used to go and pick cotton together to raise extra cash. And yet he ended up managing to not only graduate with a doctorate in laser physics from MIT, but also became a black belt in karate, an accomplished saxophone player. He ended up teaching karate to kids in Houston when he eventually became an astronaut. Yeah, he's a kind of incredible character.
And I think as somebody who still within my memory finished my dissertation and sort of how I was handling that file, he had his dissertation, a typed dissertation, stolen out of his car. How
Oh,
fast?
it was all the research
All
notes.
the research.
He hadn't it wasn't it was all the work that he'd done for the PhD before filing.
And how long did he have then until
I can't remember, Jeremy, exactly. It was like a matter of months.
a
So
matter
he
of
spent
months
years
until?
working on all this experimental data and developing the experiments. And then he had it in this old gym bag that he carried around with him. And one evening he and his wife went to watch the sunset down by the Charles River, and he put his bag down by the car before they got it. They were planning to just get in the car and drive away, and then they thought, well, no, why don't we take a moment to wander down? And he left his bag by the car, and then when he went back, they were just a few yards away, and when he went back, somehow it had disappeared and somebody had stolen it. And so he had to redo all of that research in a matter of months in order to actually get his PhD, which is kind of amazing.
It reminds me of, I think Hemingway lost a manuscript in a taxi once, and Yo-Yo Ma lost his cello once, but I think he got it back. But just amazing to sort of think about uh, uh, the diligence and the genius that it takes to reproduce that work so quickly. And on that idea of these really remarkable figures, it's hard not to think, as I read the book, it's hard for me anyway, not to start thinking in these almost cinematic terms about very about heroism, and it's there in the title. But also the flip side, and this is a trickier territory for historians or historical accounts like this to think in terms of accountability, blame, and even a kind of I don't want to go as far as saying villainy, but you know where we can look for blame in something like this. Um, and you have this distinction that for me was a new understanding of NASA and a new understanding of this kind of administration, this kind of entity that makes a very clear distinction between engineers and managers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, things like go fever or launch fever, and how a certain kind of culture takes hold among some of the managers at the expense of the good science being done by the engineers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much I would really buy that distinction in this area where you're really looking for, where you would point the finger of blame at people who are responsible for taking the decision to launch, because um, of the middle managers who are often held up as the kind of the principal villains of the story. Um, they were all, almost without exception, very experienced engineers. And this is one of the aspects of the story that I found interesting. And one of the reasons really that I wanted to write about it is that, this is with all kinds of stories like this, where you have a massive catastrophe that results in loss of life. Challenger and the Chernobyl accident is the same. It's clearly been very tempting when these stories have been retold to cast the people involved in those terms, black hats and white hats, right? Villains and heroes. But of course, in reality, we all know from our own experience that people are almost never like that, with certain, notable exceptions. But people don't wake up in that, like, so Larry Malloy is one of the middle managers who is certainly did himself no favors in the way that he talked about the accident and his role in it when the inquiry began, and was certainly, a kind of bullying and overbearing individual. But even Larry Malloy didn't get up in the mornings and look at himself in the mirror and think, I'm going to go and do something bad today,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and he was an experienced engineer. And I think that rather than him acting as a manager who was ignorant of the scientific realities of the engineering that he was responsible for, um, he was simply an engineer who thought that he knew better. He was an arrogant man. And when he pushed through this decision to launch, the night before it actually took place, he didn't think that he was knowingly sending 7 astronauts to their deaths. He just thought that they pushed their luck before with these solid rocket boosters and the seals and everything else about them. And he thought that it was going to be fine this time. He overruled people who knew better than he did just because he was an arrogant man who thought, you know, he was smarter than they were. Now,
That
were
sorry, go
there
ahead.
other managers who were not engineering experts involved in the decision making who were also culpable? Yes, there were. But I just want to be clear that it's not as, it's very easy to kind of put people into these different categories and say, well, these guys had no idea what they were doing, and these guys are experts and they were ignored. There is a bit of that, but there's also just a lot of kind of human nature at its worst, a lot of hubris, particularly institutionally within NASA, of an organization that had really just, you know, begun to believe its own press. They'd begun to believe they really could achieve the impossible on a regular basis, and it had almost always worked before. So there was a lot of this kind of institutional overconfidence at work.
And I want to emphasize that one of the words that kept coming up in my mind, not in the text, but as I read this, was how sensitive your authorial voice was to an extremely sensitive topic, to the families, obviously, of the astronauts, but also to the this sort of cast of characters of of NASA administrators and engineers and managers. So I just wanted to emphasize that I think is a really remarkable aspect of the book, how sensitively you dealt with many of these issues.
Oh, thank you. That's great to hear. I mean, the
Yeah,
part of the reason that I wanted to take such care with that, apart from all the self-evident reasons of wanting to get things right, is that it this is often seen as a kind of technical story that's unfortunately for someone who's aiming to be read by a general reader, literally rocket science, right? Um, so, but to me, it was not that. This is a very human story.
and
And
it,
when you get into it, you can see how these people who made these terrible decisions, did so for very human and very understandable reasons. That, and in their shoes, we could all have done the same thing very easily.
and I would imagine to a storyteller of any kind in a newspaper or in a work of popular nonfiction that the lure of the sort of stock characters is strong, and it's clear that you resisted that um, down the line in a way that I think speaks to the strength of the book and the insightfulness of it. You were getting toward, I think, a minute ago, something I wanted to ask about in terms of how we frame this disaster, this 1986 explosion of the Challenger shuttle. Um, there were many who were watching this, and again, believing the sort of rhetoric around that now what was getting to be uh, uh, almost decades of accident-free, amazing work. That the earlier Mercury and Apollo um, disasters were far enough, I think, in the past where there was a new sense of not infallibility, but heroism and optimism around NASA by the time we got to the middle of the 1980s. But when when I read your book, I think I'm convinced by what I think you're putting forward as 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 one argument, um, and rather than seeing this as a sudden, unforeseeable event, with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the way in which some of these issues had been dealt with before. You mentioned sort of getting lucky so many times on the O-rings and solid rockets issues. Um, it seems that the question is not how did this happen, but how did it take so long for something like this to happen in the 5+ years of the active shuttle program? Is that an accurate reading of that sort of that moment and that disaster?
No, I mean that's absolutely right, which is why I wanted to make sure that I told the story from the beginning of the shuttle program, rather than doing what some previous accounts have done, which is where you basically start the story like 2 days before the accident happens. And that's partly because I wanted people to be able to see each member of the crew and the engineers involved as fully rounded human beings and not, cardboard cutouts.
Mm-hmm.
But also because I wanted to show two things about the shuttle program. One was that how absolutely amazing it was that they did all this stuff in the first place. They're getting this machine that the engineers who worked on it came to call the most complicated machine in history, the space shuttle, into space off the ground in the first place was just an astonishing achievement. And that was the way, right the way up to the end of 1985. That's the way that we, the public, perceived the space shuttle. NASA was responsible, and the astronauts were responsible for this string of amazing achievements. Where it's like I really remember how when Bruce McCandless became the first kind of free floating human satellite in space, that picture of him alone against a backdrop of stars above the Earth's surface was on the front page of that picture was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. It was an enormous deal. And moments like that were the way in which NASA was perceived in the years before the accident. So I wanted to show those two things, but also, like you say, the fact that there were actually, many close calls in those years after 1981, after even the first launch of the shuttle was a close run thing.
Mhm. Yeah, and reframing in that way is is remarkable because we want to think about sort of daring to do these amazing things, um, and yet also, bearing in mind because of course we know that in 2003 this is going to happen again. Um,
Although a lot of people had forgotten that, forget
yeah.
that. In fact, when one of the as I'm sure you know, one of the parts of the process of preparing for publication is to get a book sent to the lawyers for a legal read.
Mm.
And when the lawyer from Simon and Schuster called me to go through the questions, the first thing she said was, I'd completely forgotten about the Columbia accident. And I mean, she's someone my age, so
What do you think that was? Was it the proximity to September 11th, or just in terms of the sort of titanic events that were happening at the time,
I
or
think,
was it because it was on
yeah,
a turn or um, sorry. So what do you think? What is
I
the
think definitely there's two things. One is, as you say, the fact that September the 11th had taken place less than 2 years before, right? And so that kind of, in terms of shocking um, media events in particular, uh, that really overshadowed everything. But the other thing is that there was really, when you look back at the history of the space program and especially American public engagement with the space program, there's a real watershed between there is all the time before the Challenger accident and then the time after. And one of the things I found remarkable about talking to, I mean, particularly the members of the families of the crew that was lost that day, is that when they were watching it happen, it was so totally unprecedented that an accident of this scale could happen, that NASA could be responsible for killing 7 astronauts live on national television. That that it didn't. There were people didn't believe that it was happening. They thought that what they could see in front of them was somehow a normal part of a planned shuttle launch, because nobody ever seen anything like that before. But come 2003, of course, when Columbia is lost, everybody knew that a space shuttle had already been lost once on live television. So when it happened again, it certainly wasn't as shattering an experience for everybody that was alive at the time.
yeah? It's amazing. I remember that the the Columbia that was also I said it was on return. It was on also on launch. Is that the
No,
Columbia?
no, it was returning.
It was
It was
return.
returning.
Okay,
It broke up on re-entry.
on reentry. It's such a it's almost surreal to think in those terms. And also, I'll say now I want to open it up definitely to all of my excellent colleagues. I recognize some folks who've joined from campus and some from beyond campus. I want to open it to everybody to please. You can either raise your hand virtually or add comments or questions to the chat. Everybody should have access to that. Please feel free to join. And one reason I know that is because I want to mention my a personal experience of the Challenger was I think I was in first grade or second grade, and I was part of a program called Pegasus that was a sort of we had a science teacher in our elementary school who had started this sort of club of a kind of NASA fever sort of group where we wanted to be, we wanted to learn all we could about the astronauts and about the space program and that kind of thing. So I don't have a vivid memory of watching it at school, as I know some of my colleagues mentioned as I started to put this together. I know some folks had sort of TVs wheeled into the room and they actually watched this happen. But if anybody has any thoughts to share about this, I think that was I was very much these were my sort of this was my pantheon of heroes. Um, these astronauts and but also I had a teacher I remember talking about the people who were in the command center who were making a lot of this possible, and so that was very exciting to be sort of vaguely aware of this as a young kid. Um, and I don't have a distinct memory of sort of seeing it or of crying, but I just remember in the weeks and months after that, being aware of this as this massive sort of devastating tragedy. But I want to welcome my colleagues to jump in. And then, as we're waiting for folks. Oh, great. Augustin, please, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute. Please jump in.
Thank you. I remember watching the explosion when I was in second grade. Same thing, teacher wheeled in the TV. We watched it. It was devastating, and I remember the teacher just turning off the TV, and everyone was just quiet. It was horrible. Um, I also remember watching on TV. I don't know if this was before or after, but that the Soviets had come up with a similar space shuttle called I think it was called like the Buran or something like that. And that that maybe, Americans were kind of nervous of like the Soviets having the edge over the shuttle programs. And that might have been one of the reasons why the Challenger was green lighted, even though there was so many potential hazards surrounding the mission. And I don't know if this comes out in your research, but do you know if there's a connection between like the Soviet space program with the Buran shuttle, and then like how did that compare to our shuttles? And if that was one of the reasons for, them taking so many risks in launching the Challenger.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So the Soviets did in fact develop the Buran, but I don't think. I mean, I never came across anything that would indicate that it had anything to do with the decision to launch Challenger, because they were actually, I mean, way behind in terms of developing the technology, which was, I mean, if you look at a photograph of the Buran and the photograph of the space shuttle, it's plainly a carbon copy. I mean, there are significant differences in the engineering, but the form that the shuttle and the Buran take is almost identical. Um, and they were in terms of funding certainly, a long way behind NASA at the time, and NASA and Buran um, only flew once, I believe, but did so under circumstances that uh, the shuttle was incapable of. They flew it remotely as a robot flight, and it went into orbit and then flew back down and returned safely to Earth. But that was the only flight it ever made.
Thanks, Augustin, for the question and the memory. Um, although obviously this is very tragic material, I also found it very rewarding to read and sort of put pieces together in terms of my childhood experience. So, Augustin, I know where you are, so let me know if you want me to walk over a copy there. Um, and others, I also want to invite others to send me a note, as I said in the chat, if you'd like a copy of Adam's really outstanding book. I was delighted to order a batch of them in, so let me know. Roger Beaujolais, I think, comes out as a fascinating figure. And I learned a little bit about your experience with his materials, his. I want to actually leave it. I want to ask you to recount that, please, because I heard you discuss this in a previous interview, and it was as dramatic as the contents of the book. So can you tell me a little bit about Roger Beaujolais and how you came across his story and also a very thorough accounting of his perspective of events?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. So, as I said, one of the challenges of writing about this story is the fact that a lot of it dwells in the arcana of rocket science. Um, and a lot of it also, you know, dwells in a lot of fluorescent lit rooms where, middle-aged white men with names like Bob and Larry sit around arguing about statistics. So it's not really on the face of it, the stuff of compelling narrative nonfiction. So when I set out to to plan the way that I wanted to approach the subject, I knew that, you know, the story needed to be carried by a handful of compelling protagonists. And one of the rocket engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, who was a member of this small group of engineers who desperately tried to stop the launch taking place the night before Challenger actually took off, was this guy, Roger Beaujolais. And part of the reason that he was an interesting character is that he seemed so unlike the stereotypical ideas that you have of engineers, physicists, rocket engineers, of being these extremely kind of literal minded, you know, statistics orientated, vanilla people who just spend all their time with their slide rules and are very measured and unemotional. Roger Beaujolais was the opposite of that. He could be extremely emotional and over emotional at times, but was really committed to his work. But the problem with this was that Beaujolais had died years before I started work on this project. And although he had given a whole series of lectures after he retired from the aerospace industry, there really wasn't that much stuff about his background that would tell me, you know, how he came to this position of being one of the leaders of this small group trying to stop the launch happening. So I started, you know, structuring the book and writing the book around what little information I had about him. And the only reason that he emerges as a kind of fully fleshed out protagonist in the book, and really I came to feel by the end of it as one of the sort of emotional hearts of the story, is because I had this really lucky break, which is that I had one of the first people I called when I started work on the book was this guy, Joe Trento, who was a CNN correspondent at the time of the accident and wrote one of two sort of instant history books. It was published in 1987 about the Challenger accident. And he had a long history of reporting on the aerospace industry. And for the book and in the years previously, he'd interviewed a lot of senior NASA figures who had died, you know, not long after the accident took place. But he'd got access to all of these people. And so part of the reason I spoke to Joe is I called him right at the beginning of my research. And I asked him if he had any of the transcripts of his research still in his files. And he said that no, he didn't, because he donated all of his papers, all of his materials to the National Air and Space Museum in actually the archive, which is out near Dulles Airport. And he said, you know, just give them a call and I'm sure they'll let you in to have a look at them. And I emailed them and they said, sure, you can come and look at whatever you want whenever we reopen, because this was in October 2020 and all federal archives had just been closed down because of COVID and then would remain closed, I think, for another 2 years, something insane. So it was 2 years before I got to go down and look for Joe's papers. And in advance of my visit, I phoned the archivist down there and I said, look, because I've now got to book in a slot to do this. And there's a long queue of people who've had their research held up by COVID. I've got to maximize my time. How long do I need to come for? And she very kindly went and pulled the boxes of Joe's stuff off the shelves and looked through and said, you know, the transcripts you're after, there's just a handful of them. So, you know, book in for 2 days. You'll be done before then. Be fine. So I went down there and she was absolutely right. You know, I opened these boxes up and there was just there's a handful of transcripts of interviews that Joe had done on dot matrix printer paper. You know, some of it so faded that it was barely legible. And I went through it in an afternoon. But then when I got to the end of it, there were 3 cartons of material, and I could hear the voice of Robert Caro in the back of my head saying, turn every page. So I was like, well, I've got another day and a half here. So I might as well, who knows what's in here. So I start going through this thing page by page. And at the end of the second box, I find this padded envelope. And inside there's a jewel case with an unmarked CD in it. And so I look at it and I think, well, you know, whatever is on this CD was put here, in the 1990s. So I'm sure it's not readable, but even if it is, whatever is on it is not going to be in any format that I can read, right? But so I go to the archivist and I say, Elizabeth, I'm sure I'm wasting both of our times here, but is there any chance you could take a look at this and see if there's anything on it that might be useful? And she says, well, sure, go off for lunch and I'll give it to the IT guy and let's see whether he can get anything off it. So I go off to the museum shop, get a sandwich. I come back half an hour later and I say, Elizabeth, I don't suppose it's only been 35 minutes. I don't suppose you had any luck with that CD. And she says, oh, yes. Just over there at the end of the room, go and take a look at that computer. That's worth a look. I sit down and there's just a single Word document up on the screen and it's 650 pages long. And it's an unpublished memoir that Roger Beaujolais wrote before he died and had never seen the light of day. And it told his entire story right from the beginning and explains, how he came to Morton Thiokol at the beginning of the shuttle program. And it tells it detailed in very vivid detail how not only what he did, but how he felt about it. And it was only because I found that I was able to bring him to life to the extent that I did on the page. And so thank you, Robert Caro.
Yeah, and I hope I know some of my history students are logging on here, and I hope you're all paying attention. That experience of sometimes the monotony of the archive, like you say, the sort of under the white neon lights and sticking with it, and indeed the sort of the voice of Robert Caro. But this experience that you had is also rewarding. Showing up and doing the work will reward that kind of diligence. My first thought when I heard that was I imagined a posthumous autobiography with a preface by Adam Higginbotham. I thought that's it's such a what an amazing resource. But of course, so much of it comes through in the text with the color and with the humanity, and again the sensitivity of the people, the sensitivity of very science-minded people, in terms of some of them having experienced disaster in the past and having lived through it and being thoroughly traumatized by it, as people who were adjacent to really major decisions or having made some of those decisions themselves that led to disasters with other with airplanes or other aspects of the program. But that really comes through the intimacy of that account. I'm interested in the transition and what came after that, of what you account on the eve of the launch. There's this really striking thing that for me it was like a metallic clunk of the decision to not to prove safety but to prove risk. And if you could sort of clarify that a little bit. The Thiokol engineers, I think, are being asked to demonstrate definitively that there is a very specific risk with the O-rings, which is not really the way science works. I think in terms of that kind of definitive way, like definitely is going to fail, as opposed to prior to that moment, the requirement by the scientists to demonstrate safety. And that gets flipped on its head. So it's obviously a much lower bar to launch. Do you have any sense of what was behind that? Agustin mentioned the sort of space race aspect of things, which may have been a part of behind it, what was behind it, the launch fever, the sort of go fever. But what is there a sense, other than sort of individual impatience or frustration or authoritativeness or even sort of officiousness in terms of approaching that, is there a sense of where that sort of that clunk happens, that decision to say we're going to go from proving safety, needing to prove safety, to needing to prove risk? And is it something that carries on beyond that, or is there a reversion again to always needing to prove safety?
Well, so that transition that you were talking about is something that happened in that specific meeting, this last minute teleconference that the Tharkle engineers called the night before the launch because they'd heard this weather forecast for the Cape, which forecast record cold weather. And they were very concerned about it because they knew that these O-rings had come close to failing before and had experienced all kinds of anomalies before, and that those anomalies were in their belief, given the data they had to date, were worsened significantly by cold weather. So they called this meeting. But that change was something that they only realized took place, after the meeting was concluded. They didn't know. It was not obvious to even them as they were sitting in the room that was what had happened. That in every flight readiness review meeting, this part of these very carefully structured engineering appraisal meetings that they would have that went on for months before each launch, the nature of that analysis, as you say, would be to prove that every system was absolutely as safe as it possibly could be, that they were meeting their threshold of what they call acceptable risk before each launch, had then in this meeting turned on its head, so that instead of having to prove before the launch could take place that everything was as safe as it could be, that if they thought there was a risk of disaster, that they could prove conclusively that risk was too great to go ahead. And, the truth was that Roger Beaujolais and the other engineers knew that they had sketchy data. They didn't really have very much hard data to back up their argument, but they were pretty sure that there was a very high risk of something going very wrong if they went ahead. But could they prove that conclusively? No, they couldn't, because they didn't feel they needed to, because in all previous meetings, if there had been that much doubt about a piece of the engineering involved in the launch, then the default position was to scrub the launch.
And there was this impatience. I'm interested in that impatience of in 1986. In that context, how much ultimately, because you deal with this with this really multifold. Obviously, this is not a short book. There's so many.
Listen, everyone, it's not that long. A lot of that stuff at the back is notes and a bibliography. It's really not that
I'll quickly add that it feels like a short book. You're going to tear through it, as I did, because it's so riveting. But it is exhaustive, I think. And so there are many forces in play. So I think that may be the sort of short answer to how this sort of pivot from needing to prove safety to needing to prove definitively the risk in which that happens, the sort of political atmosphere in which that happens. But I think I think you cover that exhaustively, and I wanted to ask a question. I sort of two ideas. One is the Gil Scott Heron Whitey on the Moon, and the other is I think it's John Glenn or Alan Shepard quote about sort of sitting on this rocket with millions of parts, all of which are made by the lowest bidder, right? So those two ideas, right? One of which is the Gil Scott Heron famous song "Whitey on the Moon" is saying, we've got fundamental problems in poor communities in this country, especially communities of color, that aren't being addressed, and actually are being addressed with sort of punitive policing and organized abandonment in terms of these communities. And then in the meantime, we're spending billions of dollars on this idea of putting Whitey on the moon, and this goes back to 69. And then on the other hand is the question of adequate funding for enormously ambitious tasks. That's encapsulated by that. I think it was John Glenn, right? The famous quote but it might have been Alan Shepard of.
It's been attributed to all sorts of different. The version of it that I quote in the book, I think, is Shepard, but
and
it's
the
been
idea is,
attributed to at least 3 different astronauts and to Werner von Braun, I think.
and the idea of everything being made by the lowest bidder, because, for example, the budget had been cut more or less in half. But how do you reconcile those two ideas? One of the idea of doing these big things about exploring space, but while also, as Martin Luther King said, a budget is a moral document, right? You're making a decision to fund this particular thing, and there's only so much funding to go around, and so funding is going to be not allocated to other things on the one hand, but then also not funding it in a way that is sufficient to ensure or adequately guarantee safety, so that we have accidents from Mercury to Apollo to Challenger and Columbia. So how do you grapple with those ideas when you sort of think of this in the big picture of a space program and enormous funds going into that, and then looking ahead to of course what we recently saw with Artemis, and also ideas about establishing some kind of permanent moon base? How do you reconcile those ideas of budget fundamentally?
I mean, I think that it's it's somewhat disingenuous from a politician's standpoint to say that it's a zero-sum game or a binary decision. It's like, just because you're paying billions of dollars to put men on the moon doesn't mean that you can't fund programs to lift up the most deprived people in society. This is the richest nation on earth. There are other things that you might be spending money on, or maybe there are ways of raising more funds by possibly, I don't know, increasing taxes or going after people who aren't paying their fair share.
We're working on that in California.
Right. But this is a society that could afford to do all of these things and should be able to, and so it's not a choice between one thing and the other. You could do both if you had the political commitment and the courage to do so. I mean, and the other thing really is that when you talk about the space shuttle program in the context of NASA's budget, I mean, they made a decision that was based on their own belief in the requirement for the agency's own survival to go ahead with developing the shuttle, even though they had been told by the White House and by Congress that they could have less than half of what they said it was going to cost to develop the program. They could have, at that point in 1969, 1970, turned around to the Nixon White House and just said, well, we can't do it. You can't. There's no more manned spaceflight because the money that you've given us is woefully inadequate to perform a task of this kind of complexity at the forefront of known technology. And they could just have said no, but they did not do that.
And that gets us back to one of the points I had in my mind of that amazing, the successes become so breathtaking in the feats of accomplishment of obviously courage, but also of just brilliant organization, brilliant science, and accomplishment, in spite of that kind of failure to fund the things they're doing. I think that's absolutely right in terms of in terms of sort of expanding the pie of possible funding, rather than thinking of this as a sort of zero sum. I want to open it one more time and remind our assembled folks here to please jump in with questions, and then I also want to respect Adam's time and move toward breaking up as we get to the top of the hour. And if while I'm waiting to see if anybody jumps in with questions or hands, I'll ask the sort of pro forma question, but definitely one I'm very interested in. What comes next?
I'm not exactly sure, but I don't want to write about spring 1986 anymore. And I really don't want to write about another disaster. And you know, I've spent a long time. I've had about 2 years to think about this. So I thought I've looked at a number of different things. I'm working on something at the moment I think should work, but we'll see. But when I was trying to come up with ideas, I became desperate enough that I thought, you know, I should look at how previous historians who have succeeded in this similar field have made it work and how they come up with ideas. So I ended up looking up the Wikipedia entry for David McCullough, and so his Wikipedia entry is quite long. And so I read that, of course, his first book, The Great Johnstown Flood, about a major disaster, right? And that book, as far as I understand it, you know, it was like the early 70s. So if you wrote a successful history book in the early 70s, you basically minted for life. But it made him a huge success. But then there was a bit of an interview in the Wikipedia entry where he's explaining his thought process for what came next. And he said, well, so I've written this book, Great Johnstown Flood. But after it had come out, I thought to myself, well, I don't want to become Bad News McCullough. And I read this because I'm thinking, oh my God, it's too late. I'm already Bad News McCullough. I've written 2 consecutive books about massive disasters. Now, you know, I'm going to have to write about a. But then, of course, I think, well, wait, what? So he didn't want to become Bad News McCullough. What did he do? Well, what he did was he wrote a book about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, followed by a book about the building of the Panama Canal. What these 2 stories have in common is there is like years, in some cases, decades of catastrophe and death and misery involved in these massive civil engineering projects that ultimately result in, you know, triumphs of human ingenuity and engineering. So we've got the Brooklyn Bridge, still stands today. Panama Canal, same thing. But, you know, up to that point, a lot of kind of terrible and therefore quite fascinating to, you know, the darkest inclinations in the reader stories. So, you know, so I was looking for something like that, but I those stories are quite hard to find.
And I also want to note that in terms of sort of the Stormcrow element of you know, showing up with such bad news, I do want to emphasize that I did find it cathartic and heartwarming, deeply sensitive, and really really a wonderful read. So you know, that definitely comes through. We did have a couple quick questions before we wrap up, and I wanted to note to Jordan Ibarra. Jordan, my email is in that last text I sent, so please email me there, and we can plan for a drop off or pickup of the book. But Emilio's question reminds me of something I read about a congressman named Garn, who has become, you know, the sort of civilian observers in the. There is now a unit of measurement, I think, called a Garn, that measures how sick astronauts get. It was their way of mocking these members of Congress who more or less we're almost holding the program hostage to say, you've got to take me up, or else, you know, I'm not gonna support funding. So another sort of, again,
it's very easy to get that idea. I don't think I explicitly state it like that, but there was a little bit of, you know, nice program you got here, shame if something should happen to it.
I think that was my extrapolation based on my estimation of some of our friendly congressional representatives. But the question from Emilio just brought that to mind. Do you see any potential for the space program to see the same admiration, hopeful atmosphere from the public, aside from the short renewed interest in the 2010s, even down to the NASA apparel craze among the youth, which we still see, and we have the JPL here around the corner. Do you think we can return to that? Currently, I feel like people associate these programs, specifically from SpaceX, with affluence and class disparity, with missions that include people such as Jeff Bezos and Katy Perry. So that sort of space tourism seems to be a little bit tarnished, perhaps, by you know, obviously association with everybody's favorite billionaires. That's a good question, Emilio. Adam, thoughts on that?
I think, Emilio, I would have totally agreed with you up until a few weeks ago when, I mean, I tuned in to the live launch of the Artemis lunar circumnavigation mission, and I was really surprised by my own. I was so excited and so proud to see that thing get off the ground in exactly the same way that I used to be as a kid when I watched archive footage of the Apollo rockets launching for the moon. And there is something, and I think, you know, I was not alone. I think that there was a genuine sense of widespread excitement in people around this country about that launch and about what they were seeing. You know, the photographs that they were sending back of the Earthrise appearing over the edge of the moon, all of that stuff. I mean, I think people that I had a real sense. I mean, this is obviously entirely anecdotal from me just reading the paper and stuff, but it seemed to me that people were really excited and really engaged by that. And I was extremely surprised, not only by how excited I was by it, but how widespread that seemed to be. And the only real way that I had to kind of explain it to myself was that there's something about the moon, about leaving Earth, always like, yeah, the International Space Station, sure, you know, all of that stuff that's been going on for decades. People just got bored of it, you know. It's just up there. It's like 150 miles away. But going to the moon, that really does seem to now, you know, still excite people in some way. So I mean, I think that there is an opportunity for that, because I totally agree with Emilio about the, you know, Bezos and Musk and Katy Perry and, you know, yeah, it's this is not the democratization of space we were promised.
I like that, and you know, sort of billionaires aside, that is an optimistic, cheerful note. And thanks for your question, Emilio. He said, "Thank you very much, answering my question, taking the time." It's a great question because it does end on a note of optimism. Adam definitely took us, I think, true to form. And again, I want to emphasize to those folks who are going to pick up the book, this is I think a tender, a sensitive, compassionate, and also really exciting story of enormous achievement in terms of what happened surrounding this terrible accident. So I really want to very, very strongly recommend it. I noted everybody my email in the chat to send me a note if you'd like a copy while supplies last. And also, if you're a faculty member and we run out of books, obviously go get your own copy. It's a terrific book. I think it helped me slot a lot of things into place in my childhood and understand not just obviously this disaster, but the political and the intellectual atmosphere that surrounded it. It was an absolute delight. Thank you, Adam. I'm excited to see what comes next.
Thank you. No, well, thank you, Jeremy, for having me, and it was great to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, and you.